2 hours, the presenters on every news channel were saying injured but expected to make a full recovery, and I have no idea why, but it made me so angry.
2 hours the presenters on every news channel were saying injured but expected to make a full recovery, and I have no idea why, but it made me, music, so angry. For years, Diana's family stayed largely silent as comparisons between Meghan Markle and Princess Diana dominated headlines around the world. What Meghan is and how she is so similar to my mom. But now that silence has reportedly been broken and the reaction music is sending shockwaves through royal watchers everywhere. What Diana's sister is said to have revealed has sparked fresh debate about loyalty, music, legacy, and whether some lines should never have been crossed. Supporters and critics are already taking sides, but the full story remains deeply controversial. Did Harry underestimate a voice he thought would never speak? Music, so what do you think? Was Diana's sister right to speak out, or should family matters stay private? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more royal stories. Whispers from Diana's inner circle. For decades, one figure remained almost completely absent from the public battles that repeatedly surrounded Princess Diana's legacy. While documentaries were released, interviews sparked controversy, and endless comparisons filled newspaper columns and television debates. Diana's sister, Lady Sarah McCorquodle, rarely entered the conversation. Unlike many people connected to one of the most famous women in modern history, she built a reputation for staying far away from publicity. That silence became part of her identity. It was not temporary. It lasted through changing royal eras, shifting public opinions, and countless moments when others might have chosen to speak. That is precisely why recent reports suggesting that Sarah has finally weighed in on the ongoing discussions surrounding Meghan Markle have generated such intense music interest. Royal watchers immediately noticed something unusual. This was not a celebrity seeking attention. This was not a commentator offering another opinion from the sidelines. This was someone who knew Diana long before the cameras arrived, long before royal life transformed everything, and long before the world turned her into an icon. The timing only deepened the intrigue. For years, comparisons between Meghan and Diana have dominated public debate. Meghan would know instantly as she was sitting on the floor, wearing what she was wearing with music, her legs in that position, wearing a white shirt. She wouldn't have known exactly what she was recreating. Supporters often point to similarities in their experiences inside royal life. While critics argue that the comparisons oversimplify two very different stories, the discussion has become one of the most persistent themes, music surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan's public journey. Yet through all of it, Sarah remained largely silent. That silence created a sense of mystery because whenever someone chooses not to speak for years, people naturally wonder what they truly think. The absence of a public opinion can become almost as powerful as a statement itself. In Sarah's music case, every year that passed without comment seemed to reinforce the belief that she preferred privacy over public involvement. Then suddenly, attention shifted. Reports began circulating that Diana's sister was no longer content to remain completely on the sidelines as debates involving Meghan, Harry, and Diana's memory continued to intensify. Whether viewed as concern, frustration, or simply a desire to offer perspective, her reported involvement immediately changed the atmosphere surrounding the story. Questions multiplied almost overnight. What prompted this change? Why now? And perhaps most importantly, what had convinced someone so private that silence was no longer the best option? Inside royal circles, curiosity reportedly grew quickly. Sarah has never been known for dramatic public interventions, which made the situation feel even more significant. Her connection to Diana gives her perspective a unique weight that few others can claim. She was not observing events from a distance. She was part of Diana's earliest life, long before the world knew her name. As speculation continued to spread, one reality became increasingly difficult to ignore. When a person who has spent decades avoiding public controversy finally appears willing to step into a sensitive debate, people assume something important has changed. Whether that assumption proves correct remains unclear. But Sarah's reported decision to break from years of silence has introduced an entirely new dimension to a story that was already filled with questions. And the consequences of that shift may only be beginning to emerge. After decades of silence, a figure long hidden from public scrutiny begins to move within royal shadows, raising urgent questions. What finally pushed her to speak now? What truth has remained buried for so long? And who stands to be exposed this time? Keep watching. Family bonds. Harry never questioned. Long before public disputes, television interviews, and endless headlines transformed the royal story into a global spectacle, Prince Harry shared a connection with a side of the family that carried special meaning. The Spencer family was not simply part of his mother's history. They were part of his own. After the death of Princess Diana in 1997, those family ties became even more important. During one of the darkest periods of his life, Harry remained connected to the relatives who had known Diana not as a princess, but as a daughter, a sister, and a family member. That shared loss created bonds that appeared strong, enduring, and difficult to break. For years, many observers assumed those relationships remained largely unchanged. The Spencers represented a direct link to Diana's world, and Harry often appeared to value that connection. From the outside, it seemed natural to believe that Diana's family would always understand his perspective better than anyone else. After all, they shared the same grief. They carried the same memories. They understood the personal side of Diana that much of the world never saw. That assumption may have become one of the most important factors in the story now unfolding. As debates surrounding Meghan Markle, royal life, and Diana's legacy grew increasingly intense, public attention often focused on the divide between Harry and the royal institution. Far less attention was paid to how Diana's own relatives viewed these developments. For a long time, their silence left room for speculation. Without public statements, many people simply filled in the blanks themselves. Some concluded that Diana's family naturally supported Harry's decisions. Others assumed they privately shared his frustrations. But assumptions are not facts, and silence can sometimes create a misleading picture. The possibility that Lady Sarah McCorquodle may view certain events differently immediately changes that equation. Her reported involvement introduces an uncomfortable question that few people seemed eager to ask. What if not everyone connected to Diana interprets recent events in the same way? What if loyalty to Harry and loyalty to Diana's memory do not always lead to identical conclusions? That possibility carries unusual weight because criticism from strangers is easy to dismiss. Criticism from within a family is something entirely different. It comes from people who share history, experience, and emotional connections that outsiders simply cannot claim. When concerns emerge from that circle, they are often viewed through a different lens. They feel more personal, music more difficult to ignore, and far more complicated to explain away. Some observers believe Harry may have expected understanding from Diana's relatives, regardless of the circumstances. Others argue there is no evidence he ever assumed such support was guaranteed. That uncertainty is part of what makes the situation so intriguing. The public does not fully know what conversations occurred behind closed doors or how family members truly felt as events unfolded over the years. What is becoming increasingly clear, however, is that the story may be more complex than many originally believed. If Diana's sister is indeed stepping forward after years of silence, her perspective has the potential to challenge assumptions that have existed for a very long time. And if those assumptions prove inaccurate, Harry may be confronting a reality he never expected. That, even within Diana's own family, agreement was never as certain as it appeared. How could someone so close to Diana's music family misread their silence as support? What really changed behind closed doors? Music, and who first began to question Harry's assumptions? And what consequences will emerge when long-held loyalties are finally tested in ways no one anticipated? Stay glued. Comparisons that refuse to fade. By the time Lady Sarah McCorquodle's reported perspective began attracting attention, one issue had already become impossible to separate from the wider story. It was not a single interview, a family disagreement, music, or a royal appearance. It was the comparison that had followed Meghan Markle for years. Again and again, public discussion returned to the same question. Was Meghan experiencing a modern version of what Princess Diana once endured? The comparison appeared in newspaper columns, television debates, documentaries, social media discussions, and countless conversations among royal watchers across the world. Over time, it became one of the most powerful and controversial narratives surrounding Meghan's public life. The fascination was easy to understand. Both women entered one of the world's most scrutinized families. Both became the subject of enormous media attention. Both faced intense public interest that often extended far beyond ordinary celebrity coverage. To many supporters, those similarities seemed obvious. They viewed Meghan's experiences through the lens of Diana's story and saw patterns they believed could not be ignored. Yet others viewed those comparisons very differently. As the years passed, critics increasingly questioned whether the similarities were being overstated. They argued that while certain experiences may have appeared comparable on the surface, the circumstances, historical context, and personal situations remained fundamentally different. What some saw as a meaningful parallel, others viewed as an oversimplification of two complex lives. The debate gradually evolved beyond facts and entered the music realm of perception, where agreement became far more difficult to achieve. This is where the reported involvement of Diana's sister becomes especially significant. Unlike commentators, journalists, or royal experts, Sarah occupies a unique position within the discussion. She knew Diana before the titles, before the palace walls, and before the relentless global attention that transformed her into a symbol recognized across continents. That personal history gives her perspective a different kind of weight. Whether people agree with her or not, her connection to Diana cannot be dismissed. For some observers, that may explain why the ongoing comparisons have reportedly caused discomfort within parts of Diana's family. The issue is not necessarily whether Meghan and Diana shared certain challenges. The more sensitive question is whether shared experiences automatically justify placing them in the same narrative. Similarity and equivalence are not always the same thing. Yet public discussions often blur the distinction. That uncertainty has become the heart of the controversy. Supporters of the comparison argue that Diana's experiences offer valuable context, music, for understanding Meghan's journey. The critics counter that repeatedly framing Meghan through Diana's story risks reducing both women to simplified versions of themselves. Between those positions sits a growing area of disagreement that remains unresolved. The more attention the comparison receives, the more emotionally charged it becomes. Every new debate appears to deepen existing divisions rather than settle them. And because Diana remains such a powerful figure in public memory, any discussion involving her legacy inevitably carries enormous emotional weight. What makes the situation even more intriguing is that there may be no universally accepted answer. The comparison continues because different people interpret the same events through entirely different lenses. Yet, if Diana's sister has indeed become concerned enough to enter the conversation, it suggests the debate has reached a point where silence itself may no longer feel neutral, and that possibility is beginning to reshape the entire story. Why does the comparison between Meghan and Diana refuse to fade? Music and who benefits from keeping it alive? What unspoken tensions does it ignite within the royal circle? And how far does the discomfort really go before everything changes? Let's find out. The Diana world few witnessed. Before Princess Diana became one of the most recognized women on earth, she was simply Diana within the Spencer family. Long before palace ceremonies, newspaper headlines, and global attention transformed her life, she existed in a world known only to those closest to her. It was a world of family gatherings, private conversations, ordinary routines, and personal relationships untouched by the pressures that would later define her public image. Few people witnessed that version of Diana more closely than her sister, Lady Sarah McCorquodle. That reality is what makes Sarah's perspective so important today. While millions formed opinions about Diana through photographs, interviews, and public appearances, Sarah knew her before any of that existed. She knew the young woman behind the headlines. She knew the family member rather than the global icon. That distinction matters because public memory often preserves only part of a person's story, while private memories can reveal a very different picture. Over the years, Diana became a symbol for many different causes, emotions, and narratives. Admirers celebrated her compassion. Critics examined her choices. Historians debated her influence. Yet, as her public image expanded, some of the quieter details of her personality became harder to see. The more famous she became, the easier it was for people to focus on the myth rather than the individual. Those closest to her, however, carried memories that existed beyond public perception. Family members remembered moments that never appeared in documentaries or front-page stories. Music, they remembered personal qualities that cameras could not fully capture. Diana's warmth, sensitivity, humor, and emotional depth were experienced firsthand by those who shared her early life. These were not carefully managed public impressions. They were everyday experiences formed long before royal expectations entered the picture. This background may help explain why ongoing comparisons involving Diana can feel deeply personal for some members of her family. Public discussions often focus on broad themes and visible events. Family members, by contrast, frequently view those same conversations through the lens of personal memory. They are not comparing public images alone. They are comparing those images to a real person they actually knew. For Sarah, that difference could carry significant weight. As debates surrounding Meghan Markle and Diana's legacy continue, Sarah's understanding of Diana is rooted in decades of shared history. Her perspective was not shaped by documentaries, commentary programs, or public narratives developed years after Diana's death. It was shaped by lived experience. That does not automatically make her interpretation correct, but it does make it uniquely informed. The tension emerges because memory itself can be powerful. It influences how people interpret present events and how they evaluate comparisons involving the past. What appears reasonable to outsiders may look entirely different to someone who possesses personal knowledge unavailable to the public. That gap between public perception and private memory often creates misunderstandings, especially when discussing figures as famous as Diana. As attention increasingly turns towards Sarah's reported views, the conversation becomes about more than Meghan Markle alone. It becomes about who gets to define Diana's story and whose perspective carries the greatest authority. While the public continues debating similarities, differences, and legacy, Sarah's memories introduce something that cannot easily be challenged or replicated. A first-hand understanding of the woman behind the legend, and that reality may become increasingly important as the larger story continues to unfold. How much of Diana's true self was hidden behind the image the world thought it knew? What memories has Sarah kept buried for years? And why are they resurfacing now? And could these revelations change everything we believed about Diana's life before royalty? Stay with us. Loyalties pulled in different directions. As attention surrounding Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and Princess Diana's legacy continued to grow, the conversation gradually became larger than any single individual. What initially appeared to be a debate about public comparisons, music, and family perspectives began evolving into something more complicated. Beneath the headlines, a quieter question was emerging. How were Diana's relatives themselves interpreting the events unfolding around them? The answer was far less straightforward than many observers assumed. For years, public discussion often treated Diana's family as a unified voice. Because they share the same connection to her, many people naturally assumed they viewed modern controversies through a similar lens. Yet, families rarely operate with complete agreement, especially when emotions, history, and personal memories are involved. The passage of time may unite relatives through shared experiences, but it can also shape very different interpretations of those experiences. That reality appears increasingly relevant as scrutiny surrounding Harry and Meghan continues. At the center of the situation sits a difficult balance between public loyalty and private conviction. Supporting a family member does not always mean agreeing with every decision. Likewise, expressing concern does not necessarily signal rejection or hostility. Those distinctions are often lost in public debates where people frequently expect individuals to choose clear sides. Inside families, however, emotions are usually more complicated than simple loyalty or opposition. For Diana's relatives, that complexity may be especially difficult to navigate. On one hand stands Harry, a son who endured the loss of his mother under extraordinary circumstances and has spoken openly about the impact that loss had on his life. On the other hand stands the memory of Diana herself, a figure whose legacy carries profound emotional significance for those who knew her personally. When conversations begin blending those two realities together, difficult questions naturally emerge. The situation becomes even more sensitive because ongoing royal disputes have shown little sign of disappearing. Years after Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties, disagreements continue generating headlines across multiple countries. Each new interview, documentary, public appearance, or reported disagreement seems to reignite existing tensions. What may have once appeared temporary now feels like a long-running conflict with no obvious conclusion. That persistence appears to be creating growing unease among some observers. The concern is not necessarily tied to one event or one statement. Instead, it centers on the broader narrative taking shape around Diana's legacy. As comparisons continue and competing interpretations gain attention, some family members may worry that Diana's story is gradually being drawn into modern disputes so that she can no longer influence herself. Of course, others might argue the opposite. They may believe Diana's experiences remain relevant and that discussing them helps provide important context for understanding current events. That perspective remains part of the debate, music, and helps explain why opinions differ so strongly. The challenge is that both sides often claim to be protecting the same legacy while reaching entirely different conclusions about what that protection should look like. As reported perspectives from figures such as Lady Sarah McCorquodle attract increasing attention, the stakes continue rising. What once seemed like a disagreement involving only Harry, Meghan, and the royal family music now appears connected to a broader network of relatives, memories, and competing responsibilities. The deeper the conversation goes, the clearer it becomes that this is no longer simply about public perception. It is becoming a debate about who carries the authority to define Diana's story. And that debate is only becoming more complicated with time. Different branches of Diana's family begin to see the unfolding tensions in starkly opposing ways as music, private emotions collide with public expectations. Who is quietly shaping the narrative behind closed doors? And what fractures are about to emerge when loyalty is tested? Let's unravel the mystery. The moment silence became impossible. For years, Lady Sarah McCorquodle managed to stay outside the growing storms that surrounded Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and the legacy of Princess Diana. While headlines intensified, documentaries appeared, and public debates stretched across television screens and social media platforms, Sarah remained largely absent from the conversation. Her silence was consistent, deliberate, music, and remarkably rare in a story that seemed to attract commentary from almost everyone connected to it. Yet, the question now drawing attention is not why she stayed silent for so long. It is what may have finally persuaded her that silence was no longer enough. The answer appears to lie in a series of developments that gradually transformed an ongoing discussion into something far more difficult to ignore. None of these developments emerged overnight. Instead, they accumulated over time, building layer upon layer of controversy until the broader conversation began taking on a different character. What started as debates about Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties eventually expanded into larger questions involving Diana's memory, her legacy, and the way her story continued to be referenced in modern public disputes. One recurring theme stood above the rest. Comparisons between Meghan and Diana never disappeared. In fact, they seemed to become more frequent as public music interest grew. Every new controversy, every interview, and every major development appeared to revive the discussion. Supporters pointed to similarities in media treatment and public scrutiny. Critics argued that the comparisons oversimplified two very different lives, as those opposing interpretations collided repeatedly. The debate became increasingly emotional. For someone like Sarah, that situation may have carried a unique significance. Unlike commentators observing from a distance, she possessed personal memories of Diana that predated the public narrative entirely. The version of Diana she knew was not a symbol or a headline. It was a sister. As a result, ongoing public discussions about Diana's life may have felt very different from the way they appeared to outsiders. At the same time, tensions surrounding Harry's relationship with both the royal family and public opinion showed little sign of easing. Years after major disagreements first emerged, new controversies continued drawing attention. Rather than fading with time, existing divisions often seemed to deepen. Every fresh development encouraged renewed debate about loyalty, responsibility, and the long-term consequences of choices made by all sides. This combination of factors may have created what some observers view as a tipping point. Not one dramatic event, but an accumulation of events. Not a sudden shock, but a gradual realization that the conversation was moving in a direction that could no longer be ignored. The significance lies not only in what was being discussed, but in how frequently Diana's name continued appearing at the center of those discussions. Of course, interpretations differ. Some believe Sarah's reported involvement reflects concern about how Diana's legacy is being used. Others argue she may simply want to provide perspective in a debate that has become increasingly polarized. Without direct insight into private motivations, certainty remains impossible. What is clear, however, is that something changed. A figure known for decades of restraint now appears connected to a conversation she once avoided. That shift alone suggests the story has entered a new phase. If silence was once viewed as the safest path, recent developments may have convinced Sarah that remaining quiet carried its own risks and that realization could prove far more significant than anyone initially expected. Why did Sarah finally choose this moment? And what unseen pressure pushed her past the point of silence? Was it the latest public controversy, the lingering Diana comparisons, or something more personal building behind closed doors? And what happens once the truth starts slipping out? Whispers behind closed palace doors. In the quiet spaces away from cameras, the conversation surrounding Harry, Meghan Markle, and the legacy of Princess Diana began to shift into something. Music, far more private and complex. While the public continued to focus on visible statements, music, interviews, and royal commentary, there were reportedly quieter discussions taking place within family circles that never reached public view. These conversations were not described as confrontational, but as careful attempts to understand how ongoing tensions might affect relationships, reputations, and the long-term stability of the family narrative. According to reports, members of Diana's wider family circle, including Lady Sarah McCorquodle, were increasingly aware that silence in public did not mean silence in private. As debates about Meghan Markle and Prince Harry continued to circulate globally, the pressure to respond internally appeared to grow, even among those who had previously avoided involvement. Inside these private discussions, music concern was reportedly less about public opinion itself and more about how those opinions were shaping the long-term perception of Princess Diana's legacy. Some family members are said to have worried that repeated comparisons between Diana and Meghan Markle were beginning to blur distinctions that had always been clear within the family. Others, however, believed that public discourse had simply grown beyond anyone's ability to control, especially given the scale of global attention surrounding both women. What made the situation more delicate was the understanding that any perceived comment from within Diana's family could quickly become part of a much larger media narrative. Even those who preferred to remain silent appeared to recognize that their silence itself was being interpreted in different ways by outside observers. Increasingly, the issue was not just about Meghan Markle or Prince Harry, but about how Diana's memory was being used as a reference point in ongoing disputes. As the discussions continued behind closed doors, the sense grew that the family was navigating not only public scrutiny, but also internal disagreement over how to respond. This emerging divide did not present itself as open conflict, but rather as subtle differences in interpretation, tone, and responsibility. Yet even subtle differences carried weight because they touched directly on the legacy of Princess Diana and how it should be understood today. For some observers, this growing tension suggested that the narrative surrounding Diana's family was no longer unified, but quietly fragmented across perspectives. The more these private conversations remained out of public view, the more speculation increased about what each family member truly believed. At the center of it all remained a shared concern over Diana's memory and music, how it continued to shape every new development. As these internal dynamics evolved, the wider story began to feel less like a public debate and more like an ongoing private struggle with public consequences. What emerged from behind closed doors was not clarity, but a deeper awareness that the situation was still unfolding in unpredictable ways. While no definitive answers were offered, the growing awareness of unseen discussions suggested that Diana's legacy, Harry's position, and Meghan's public role were all becoming part of a much larger and unresolved family narrative entirely. Behind those private doors, conversations unfolded far from public view, shaping outcomes no one expected. What was really said when cameras stopped rolling, who made the final call, and what consequences were quietly set in motion that the public is not yet aware of. All keep watching.